it's very hard to keep up, particularly when you try to dash about the country as well.
At 75, King Charles has finally acknowledged something many people quietly believed for decades. 4 years, questions followed him, from his uneasy rise as heir to the controversies that shaped his public image. Now, with the crown on his head and history watching closely, Charles appears ready to confront truths the monarchy once preferred to leave unspoken. The prince who never fit the mold. Long before the crown ever touched his head, there was already a quiet uncertainty surrounding the boy who would one day become king. Not a scandal, not a crisis, just a lingering feeling that Prince Charles was different from what the public expected a future monarch to be. From the moment he was born on November 14, 1948, his destiny was already written. As the eldest son of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, Charles was not simply another royal child. He was the future of the British monarchy. The crown was not a possibility for him, it was an inevitability. And that inevitability came with a weight very few people could ever understand. Unlike ordinary children, Charles did not grow up with the freedom to explore who he wanted to be. Every school he attended, every public appearance he made, every word he spoke was observed through the lens of expectation. Britain was not simply raising a prince. It was preparing a king. But almost from the beginning, something about Charles seemed out of step with that expectation. While previous heirs to the throne were often portrayed as confident, commanding figures ready to embody national strength, Charles showed a far more introspective side. He was thoughtful, sensitive, and deeply reflective, qualities that might be admirable in private life but which, in the public imagination, did not always align with the image of royal authority. Even as a young boy, observers noticed that Charles appeared more reserved than the typical royal figure. And that difference only became more visible as he grew older. His time at Gordonstoun School in Scotland became one of the most frequently discussed chapters of his early life. The school had been chosen by his father, Prince Philip, who believed the rigorous environment would help toughen his son. Gordonstoun emphasized discipline, physical endurance, and character-building challenges. But for Charles, the experience was reportedly far from empowering. The young prince struggled in the harsh atmosphere. He was said to feel isolated, misunderstood, and often uncomfortable in an environment that celebrated toughness over sensitivity. For someone who preferred books, music, and intellectual curiosity, Gordonstoun felt less like preparation for leadership and more like a constant test he never quite felt suited for. Those years quietly shaped how many people began to see him. Instead of the confident future king many expected, Charles appeared hesitant, occasionally awkward in public, and sometimes unsure of how to carry the enormous role awaiting him. The British public had grown used to monarchs who projected quiet strength and unwavering composure. Queen Elizabeth II, even from a young age, seemed naturally aligned with the responsibilities of the crown. Charles, by contrast, often seemed like a man searching for his place within an institution that had already decided who he had to become. As he entered adulthood, those perceptions did not disappear, they intensified. While many expected the Prince of Wales to focus primarily on ceremonial duties and traditional royal responsibilities, Charles developed interests that were considered unusual for a future king. He spoke passionately about environmental protection long before climate change became a global conversation. He expressed strong views on architecture and urban planning. He supported organic farming and sustainable living. Today, these concerns might seem visionary, but decades ago, they made him appear unconventional, sometimes even eccentric. Critics wondered why the future king seemed more interested in farmland, forests, and philosophical ideas than the political neutrality expected of the monarchy. Supporters, however, saw something else entirely. They saw a man who was thinking ahead of his time. Still, the perception gap between Charles and the public continued to grow. Many people simply didn't know what to make of him. He was neither the charismatic royal celebrity nor the stoic symbol of authority that previous generations associated with the monarchy. Instead, Charles occupied an awkward space somewhere in between, and that uncertainty created whispers that followed him for decades. Was he truly suited to be king? It was a question that lingered quietly in newspaper columns, political commentary, and public conversations. Not always spoken directly, but rarely absent. Part of the challenge was the towering presence of his mother. Queen Elizabeth II would go on to become the longest reigning monarch in British history, admired for her discipline, stability, and unwavering commitment to duty. Her calm leadership became the defining image of the modern monarchy. Standing beside that legacy was never going to be easy for any heir. But for Charles, the comparison felt almost constant. Every speech he gave, every public appearance he made, every moment of hesitation seemed magnified by the simple fact that he was not Elizabeth. He was Charles. And for many years, the public wasn't quite sure what that meant for the future of the crown. Yet behind the doubts, something else was happening quietly. While critics questioned his suitability, Charles was slowly building a different kind of royal legacy, one rooted not in tradition alone, but in causes he genuinely believed could shape the future. Through the prince's trust, he began helping disadvantaged young people find employment and training opportunities. Through environmental advocacy, he started raising alarms about ecological damage long before most world leaders paid attention. These initiatives revealed a side of Charles that was rarely captured in headlines. A prince who may not have fit the traditional mold, but who was steadily carving out a purpose of his own. And yet, even as his charitable work grew and his voice became more confident, the doubts surrounding him never fully disappeared. If anything, they were only waiting for the moment when his personal life would place him under a spotlight far brighter than anything he had experienced before. Because soon, the story of Prince Charles would become inseparable from a young woman who would change the monarchy forever. Princess Diana. And once she entered the picture, the quiet uncertainty surrounding Charles would transform into something far more complicated, and far more difficult to escape. The marriage that changed everything. By the early 1980s, Prince Charles was approaching his mid-30s, and the pressure surrounding his personal life had reached an unmistakable intensity. For years, the British public had watched the future king closely, waiting for the moment when he would finally settle down and produce the next generation of royal heirs. In many ways, the monarchy itself seemed to need that moment. The institution was entering a new era. Television was transforming public life, media attention was growing more intense, and the royal family understood that the image of a young, glamorous couple could bring renewed excitement to the crown. And when Charles became engaged to Lady Diana Spencer in 1981, it appeared that the monarchy had found exactly that. Diana was young, elegant, and instantly captivating. At just 20 years old, she possessed a natural charm that seemed almost effortless. Cameras loved her. Crowds adored her. From the moment the engagement was announced, she quickly became the center of public fascination, not only in Britain but around the world. Their wedding, held at St. Paul's Cathedral in July 1981, became one of the most watched events in modern history. Millions gathered in the streets of London, while hundreds of millions more tuned in from across the globe. The ceremony looked like something lifted directly from a fairy tale. A prince. A beautiful young bride. A monarchy glowing under the spotlight of global admiration. For a brief moment, it seemed as though everything had aligned perfectly. But behind the spectacle, the reality of the relationship was far more complicated than the world realized. The age gap between Charles and Diana was significant. 12 years separated them. More importantly, they had entered the marriage from completely different worlds. Charles had spent decades preparing for royal duty, navigating court expectations and media scrutiny. Diana, by contrast, had lived a relatively quiet life before suddenly finding herself at the center of one of the most famous institutions on earth. The transition was overwhelming. Within months of the wedding, the pressures of royal life began to take their toll. Diana struggled with the constant attention and the rigid expectations that came with her new role. The young princess was expected to appear flawless at every public engagement while privately adjusting to a life she had barely begun to understand. Meanwhile, Charles remained deeply immersed in the responsibilities that had defined his entire adult life. The emotional distance between them slowly became harder to ignore. Yet in the public eye, Diana's star continued to rise. What made Diana different from previous royal figures was her extraordinary ability to connect with people. Whether she was visiting hospitals, comforting children, or speaking with individuals often ignored by society, she displayed a level of empathy that resonated deeply with the public. People didn't just admire Diana. They felt close to her. Her warmth, vulnerability, and openness made her appear relatable in a way few royal figures had ever managed before. Soon, she was no longer simply the Princess of Wales. She became known as the People's Princess. And as Diana's popularity soared, something else quietly happened. Prince Charles began to fade into the background. The contrast between them became impossible to ignore. Diana appeared emotionally expressive and naturally charismatic. Charles, on the other hand, often seemed reserved, careful, and sometimes uncomfortable in the very spotlight that Diana navigated so effortlessly. The media noticed. And once the media noticed, the narrative began to take shape. Newspapers and television programs increasingly framed the royal couple as opposites. Diana the compassionate, radiant princess, and Charles the distant, overly serious prince. Whether fair or not, that portrayal began to influence how millions of people viewed their marriage. Then came the rumors. At first, they circulated quietly, whispers in tabloids, speculation among royal watchers. But gradually, those whispers grew louder as reports surfaced about Charles's long-standing relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles. Camilla had been part of Charles's life long before he married Diana. The two had developed a close bond years earlier, and despite Charles's marriage, that connection had never fully disappeared. As the truth slowly began to emerge, public opinion shifted dramatically. The image of the royal fairy tale started to crack. By the early 1990s, the marriage was no longer merely strained. It was unraveling in front of the world. Interviews, leaked recordings, and constant tabloid coverage turned the private struggles of the Prince and Princess of Wales into one of the most sensational stories of the decade. But nothing reshaped public perception more than a single television interview. In 1995, Diana sat down with BBC journalist Martin Bashir for what would become one of the most famous interviews in royal history. Speaking with striking honesty, she discussed the emotional difficulties she had experienced within the royal family and the pain of her failing marriage. During that interview, she delivered a line that would echo across the world. "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." With that one sentence, the public narrative surrounding Charles changed permanently. For millions of viewers, the story suddenly felt clear. Diana became the sympathetic figure, vulnerable, wronged, and courageous enough to speak openly about her suffering. Charles, meanwhile, was increasingly cast as the distant husband who had allowed another relationship to overshadow his marriage. The damage to his public image was immense. Within a year, the marriage officially ended in divorce. But the story did not end there. In 1997, tragedy struck when Princess Diana died in a car accident in Paris. The shock reverberated around the globe. Crowds gathered outside royal residences. Tributes poured in from world leaders and ordinary citizens alike. The grief felt universal. And once again, Charles found himself at the center of intense public scrutiny. The royal family's initial response to Diana's death was widely criticized as too reserved, too formal for the overwhelming emotional outpouring taking place outside palace gates. Many people felt the monarchy had underestimated the depth of public attachment to Diana. Charles, however, made a decision that would quietly reshape how some people viewed him. He traveled to Paris to personally accompany Diana's body back to Britain, ensuring that the mother of his children would be brought home with dignity. In the days that followed, he walked behind her coffin alongside Prince William and Prince Harry in a procession watched by millions. It was one of the most solemn moments in modern royal history. Yet even then, Diana's memory continued to cast a powerful shadow. Her compassion, her connection with ordinary people, and the tragic nature of her death elevated her to an almost legendary status. 4 years afterward, Charles struggled to step out from that shadow. To many, he remained the prince whose marriage to Diana had collapsed in public view. But what few realized at the time was that those years would quietly shape the man Charles would eventually become. Because the lessons learned during that turbulent chapter of his life, about public perception, emotional connection, and the fragile relationship between the monarchy and the people, would follow him all the way to the throne. And decades later, as king, those lessons would begin to influence the way he approached the crown itself. The longest wait in royal history. For most heirs to the throne, the journey toward kingship follows a relatively predictable rhythm. A prince is born, raised within the traditions of the monarchy, gradually takes on responsibilities, and eventually ascends the throne while still in the prime of life. But Prince Charles lived a very different story. His path to the crown was defined not by preparation alone, but by waiting. An extraordinary, decades-long wait that quietly became one of the most unusual chapters in British royal history. By the time the 21st century arrived, Charles had already spent more years as heir apparent than any royal figure before him. While previous heirs often ascended the throne in their 40s or 50s, Charles remained the Prince of Wales well into his 60s and eventually his 70s. For more than 70 years, he stood just one step away from the crown. Yet that step never seemed to arrive. His mother, Queen Elizabeth II, reigned with remarkable stability and longevity. She became a symbol of continuity for Britain through decades of political change, global crises, and social transformation. Her presence was so steady, so enduring, that the idea of the monarchy without her almost felt unimaginable. And in the shadow of that extraordinary reign stood Charles, the prince who was always preparing, always waiting. This prolonged waiting period created a unique kind of pressure, one that few people outside the royal world could truly grasp. Charles was expected to prepare for the most important role of his life without ever knowing when, or even if, that role would finally arrive. As the years passed, a new question quietly emerged. Would Charles ever truly become king? By the early 2000s, conversations about the future of the monarchy had begun to shift. Prince William, young and charismatic, had quickly captured public affection in a way that reminded many people of his mother. Some commentators even speculated about the possibility, however unlikely, that the crown might skip Charles entirely and pass directly to William. These discussions were never official, of course. But the very fact that they existed revealed how uncertain Charles's position sometimes appeared in the public imagination. Despite these whispers, Charles did not spend his decades as heir simply marking time. In fact, those years became some of the most active and productive of his life. Freed from the immediate responsibilities of the crown, Charles used his position to champion causes that were often overlooked by mainstream political leadership. Long before climate change dominated global discussions, he was already speaking about environmental responsibility, sustainable agriculture, and the protection of natural ecosystems. In the 1970s and 1980s, such views were often considered unusual for a royal figure. Some critics even dismissed his environmental advocacy as eccentric. But Charles remained persistent. He spoke about deforestation when it was rarely discussed in political debates. He warned about pollution and unsustainable farming practices decades before those topics became widely accepted global concerns. Over time, what once seemed unconventional began to look increasingly visionary. In many ways, Charles had been raising alarms about environmental issues long before the rest of the world caught up. Beyond environmentalism, he also became deeply involved in charitable initiatives. Perhaps the most notable example was the Prince's Trust, an organization he founded in 1976 to help disadvantaged young people develop job skills, start businesses, and build stable futures. Over the decades, the program grew into one of the most successful youth support charities in the United Kingdom. Hundreds of thousands of young people received training, mentorship, and financial assistance through the trust. For many of them, the program represented a second chance, an opportunity to build a life that might otherwise have remained out of reach. Through these initiatives, Charles slowly began reshaping his public image. He was no longer simply the prince waiting for a crown. He was a royal figure actively using his platform to influence social issues, environmental awareness, and community development. Yet even as his charitable work earned respect, the perception of him as an unconventional royal figure never fully disappeared. Charles had strong opinions about architecture, famously criticizing certain modern buildings that he believed clashed with Britain's historic character. He advocated for traditional design principles and even helped establish projects focused on sustainable urban planning. To some observers, this level of involvement seemed refreshing. To others, it raised questions about whether a future monarch should express such personal views on public matters. The monarchy, after all, had long relied on strict political neutrality as a cornerstone of its stability. Charles often walked a delicate line, carefully expressing his beliefs without crossing into direct political advocacy. Still, the debate surrounding his approach only reinforced the sense that Charles was unlike any previous heir to the throne. As the years continued to pass, the contrast between Charles's long wait and his mother's enduring reign became more striking. The Queen's consistency provided reassurance during times of uncertainty. Her calm presence had guided Britain through enormous historical shifts, from the Cold War to the digital age. For Charles, stepping into that legacy would eventually require not only leadership but also the ability to convince the public that he could carry the institution forward. By the time he reached his 70s, Charles had spent virtually his entire life preparing for a role he had never yet performed. Few leaders in modern history have had such an unusual apprenticeship. 70 years of preparation. 70 years of observation. 70 years of watching the monarchy evolve while waiting for the moment when he would finally be responsible for guiding it himself. And when that moment finally arrived in September 2022, it came with both solemnity and uncertainty. Queen Elizabeth II's passing marked the end of an era that had lasted longer than most people's lifetimes. For millions of people across Britain and the Commonwealth, the transition felt historic and emotional. Suddenly, the prince who had waited his entire life was no longer waiting. He was king. Yet even as he assumed the throne, many observers quietly wondered what kind of monarch he would become. Would he remain the outspoken advocate for environmental reform and social change? Or would the responsibilities of the crown transform his approach completely? Because after decades of speaking openly about issues he cared deeply about, Charles now faced a different reality. As king, every word carried far greater weight. Every gesture could shape the perception of the monarchy itself. And that meant the man who had spent most of his life expressing strong opinions might now have to adopt a far more restrained voice. It was a transformation that few people had truly anticipated. But as Charles stepped into the role he had prepared for all his life, signs began to appear that something fundamental had changed. The prince who had spent decades waiting was slowly becoming something else entirely. A king learning, perhaps for the first time, that the crown demands silence in places where a prince might once have spoken freely. And that realization would soon shape the most revealing admission of his life: the family fractures that followed the crown. For all the public debates surrounding Prince Charles, his suitability as king, his long wait for the throne, and the controversies of his past, there was another dimension of his life unfolding quietly behind palace walls: his role as a father. To the outside world, the image of Charles with his two sons, Prince William and Prince Harry, often appeared carefully composed. Public photographs showed them attending royal events together, smiling at crowds, representing the future of the monarchy as a united family. But the reality of raising two princes under the relentless gaze of global media was far more complicated than those images suggested. Everything changed in 1997. When Princess Diana died in the car crash in Paris, the loss did not only shake the world, it reshaped the lives of two young boys who suddenly found themselves growing up without their mother. Prince William was 15. Prince Harry was just 12. And in that moment, Charles faced a responsibility unlike any he had experienced before. Beyond the duties of royalty, beyond the expectations of the crown, he was now the single parent of two grieving sons whose pain was unfolding in front of an entire planet. The pressure was immense. Every decision he made was watched, analyzed, and debated in public. The royal family itself was navigating unfamiliar territory as waves of public grief spread across Britain. Outside Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace, mountains of flowers appeared as mourners gathered to express their sorrow. Inside the royal household, the challenge was deeply personal. Charles had to find a way to guide his sons through unimaginable loss while also protecting them from the overwhelming attention that surrounded them. It was a delicate balance between duty and fatherhood, and it was not always easy. For Prince William, the transition into adulthood followed a path that closely mirrored the traditional expectations of royal life. As the eldest son, he understood early on that he would one day inherit the throne after his father. Over time, William appeared to embrace that role with increasing confidence. He pursued education, military service, and eventually marriage to Catherine Middleton, now the Princess of Wales, creating a modern royal partnership that many people saw as a continuation of the monarchy's stability. But the story for Prince Harry unfolded very differently. From the beginning, Harry's personality stood in contrast to the structured life of the institution he was born into. While William seemed comfortable within the framework of royal responsibility, Harry often appeared restless with the limitations that came with it. His military service earned him respect and admiration, particularly for his deployment to Afghanistan. Yet even as he matured, there remained an undercurrent of tension between Harry and the royal establishment. That tension would eventually erupt into one of the most public family conflicts the monarchy had faced in decades. When Prince Harry and his wife Meghan Markle announced their decision in 2020 to step back from their roles as senior members of the royal family, the news sent shockwaves through the institution. The couple's departure from royal duties, and their relocation to the United States, immediately sparked intense debate. Supporters viewed the move as an attempt by Harry to protect his family and carve out a life independent from the pressures of royal expectations. Critics, however, saw it as a dramatic break from tradition that risked undermining the unity of the monarchy. And once again, King Charles, still Prince Charles at the time, found himself at the center of a deeply personal crisis playing out on a global stage. The situation grew even more complicated after Harry and Meghan began speaking publicly about their experiences within the royal family. In interviews and media appearances, Harry described feelings of isolation and frustration, suggesting that the institution had sometimes struggled to support him and his wife. At times, his comments included direct criticism of the royal system itself. For Charles, the situation presented a difficult dilemma. As a father, he faced the emotional reality of a strained relationship with his younger son. As the future king, he also had to consider the stability and reputation of the monarchy, an institution built on tradition, discretion, and unity. Balancing those two roles was never going to be simple. Unlike many public disputes, royal family disagreements unfold under extraordinary scrutiny. Every photograph, every appearance, every subtle gesture between family members becomes the subject of analysis. Observers watched closely for signs of reconciliation or further distance. Meanwhile, Prince William's position within the monarchy continued to strengthen. His growing role alongside Catherine, combined with his steady approach to royal duties, helped reinforce the public perception that he represented the next stable chapter of the institution. This contrast between the two brothers, one moving deeper into royal life, the other stepping away from it, created a powerful narrative that the media followed relentlessly. And once again, Charles stood in the middle. For much of his life, he had been the heir navigating expectations from above. Now he was the father watching tensions unfold between the two sons who represented the monarchy's future. The emotional complexity of that situation cannot be overstated. Few leaders in history have had to manage both national symbolism and deeply personal family conflict at the same time. Yet as Charles eventually ascended the throne in 2022 following the death of Queen Elizabeth II, the situation with Harry remained unresolved. Public appearances showed the royal family continuing its duties, but the distance between Harry and the institution he once served had become unmistakable. Despite this, Charles adopted a notably restrained approach. Rather than responding publicly to criticism or engaging in family disputes through the media, he largely maintained the silence traditionally associated with the monarchy. It was a strategic choice, one that reflected an understanding that public arguments could damage the institution far more than quiet patience. In many ways, it was a sign of how Charles himself had changed. Earlier in his life, he had sometimes been more vocal about issues that mattered to him. But as king, the role demanded a different kind of discipline, one that placed the stability of the monarchy above personal expression. And perhaps nowhere was that restraint more visible than in the way he handled the tensions within his own family. Behind the ceremonies, the speeches, and the formal appearances of royal life, the personal dimension of Charles's journey continued to shape the man he had become. Because after decades of scrutiny, criticism, and family challenges, the king who now sat on the throne was no longer the uncertain prince of earlier years. He was someone who had spent a lifetime learning difficult lessons about responsibility, public perception, and the fragile balance between private emotion and public duty. Lessons that would soon lead to the moment when Charles, now in his mid-70s, would quietly acknowledge something many observers had suspected all along. A realization that would reveal just how much the crown had changed him. The admission that changed the narrative. When King Charles finally ascended the throne in September 2022, the moment carried an almost surreal weight. For decades, the idea of Charles becoming king had existed more as a distant certainty than an immediate reality. The world had grown accustomed to Queen Elizabeth II's presence, steady, unwavering, almost timeless. And suddenly, that era was over. The prince who had spent more than 70 years preparing for the role was now the monarch himself. For many observers, the transition came with a quiet question lingering in the background. What kind of king would Charles actually be? Throughout his life as Prince of Wales, Charles had developed a reputation for speaking openly about causes he believed in. He championed environmental protection when the issue received little mainstream attention. He advocated for sustainable agriculture, traditional architecture, and community-based development. In some ways, he had been one of the most outspoken heirs in modern royal history. But becoming king changed the rules entirely. The British monarchy survives on a delicate balance, remaining visible enough to represent the nation while staying neutral enough to avoid political controversy. As Prince of Wales, Charles had more freedom to express personal views. As king, every word carried constitutional implications. And slowly, people began noticing something different. The Charles who stepped onto the throne seemed quieter, more measured, more cautious. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. There was no grand announcement declaring a transformation. Instead, it appeared in subtle ways, through speeches that focused on unity rather than personal advocacy, through carefully chosen public statements, and through an approach that emphasized continuity over change. For a man who had spent decades speaking passionately about global challenges, the shift was noticeable. And eventually, Charles himself acknowledged it. At 75, reflecting on the responsibilities of the crown, the king admitted something that many observers had long suspected. His role as monarch required him to step back from the personal activism that had defined much of his earlier life. In other words, the crown demanded restraint. For years, critics had wondered whether Charles would be able to make that adjustment. Some believed his strong opinions might clash with the monarchy's tradition of political neutrality. Others questioned whether someone so deeply invested in environmental advocacy could truly remain above the political landscape. But Charles's own reflections suggested that he understood the change required. The transition from prince to king was not simply about a new title. It was about redefining his entire public voice. In private discussions and public remarks, Charles made it clear that while his personal beliefs had not disappeared, his responsibilities as monarch required him to serve as a unifying figure above individual causes. That realization marked a quiet but profound turning point. For decades, Charles had been the royal figure willing to challenge convention, speak openly about the future, and advocate for ideas that sometimes made political leaders uncomfortable. Now, as king, he was stepping into a different role entirely. One that demanded patience, neutrality, and a careful understanding of the monarchy's place in a modern democracy. But this shift did not mean Charles had abandoned the principles that shaped his life. Instead, those ideas seemed to influence the way he approached the throne itself. Rather than pursuing dramatic reforms, Charles focused on steady leadership, continuing the charitable work that had defined much of his career while ensuring that the monarchy remained stable during a period of transition. He increased his presence at diplomatic engagements, state functions, and international events. His schedule quickly filled with responsibilities that reflected the global nature of Britain's constitutional monarchy. And gradually, the early doubts surrounding his reign began to soften. The public saw a king who appeared deeply aware of the gravity of the role he had inherited. There was a sense of reflection in his speeches, a recognition that the monarchy he now led had been shaped by centuries of tradition and decades of his mother's remarkable leadership. At the same time, Charles also demonstrated an understanding that the institution must adapt to changing times. The modern monarchy faces challenges very different from those of previous generations. Public expectations have evolved. Transparency, accessibility, and relevance have become increasingly important in maintaining public support. Charles appeared determined to guide the institution carefully through that transition. And perhaps most importantly, he seemed willing to learn from the past. The controversies of earlier decades, the struggles of his marriage, the intense media scrutiny, the complicated dynamics within his family, had shaped his public image in ways that once seemed impossible to escape. But as king, Charles appeared to approach those memories with a level of humility that many people had not expected. When he acknowledged the lasting influence of Princess Diana, he did so with an understanding of how deeply she had connected with the public. When questions arose about tensions within the royal family, he responded with restraint rather than confrontation. For someone whose life had unfolded under relentless public observation, that restraint carried its own message. The boy who once struggled under the expectations of royalty had grown into a monarch shaped by experience, criticism, and decades of reflection. And in many ways, that long journey may have prepared him for the crown in ways no traditional royal path ever could. Because Charles did not simply inherit the throne. He spent an entire lifetime learning what it meant to carry it. Today, as King Charles III continues to define his reign, the world watches with a mixture of curiosity and cautious respect. The questions that once surrounded him have not disappeared completely, but they now exist alongside a recognition that the monarchy itself is evolving. A new generation of royals is stepping forward. Prince William and Catherine represent the future of the institution. Their presence signals continuity while also reflecting a modern approach to royal service. And at the center of that transition stands Charles, a king who waited longer than any monarch in British history to claim the crown. Perhaps that long wait gave him something few leaders ever receive. Time. Time to reflect. Time to learn from mistakes. Time to understand both the power and the limits of the role he would eventually inherit. And now, at 75, the king appears to understand something that may have taken a lifetime to fully grasp. The crown is not about personal ambition. It is about service. But what do you think? Do you believe King Charles has successfully stepped into his role as monarch after such an extraordinarily long journey to the throne? Or do the controversies of the past still shape how the public views him today? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy exploring the untold stories and hidden dynamics of the royal family, be sure to subscribe and join us for more deep dives into the history, power, and personalities shaping the monarchy today.